I am so excited about this color of conversation today because we're going to be talking about voting rights. It is incredibly important. And I have I can't even tell you about these two people. They're so amazing and they're at the forefront for change. So let me just tell you who they are. Mr. Marc Morial. Marc Morial has been described as one of the few national leaders to possess street smarts and boardroom savvy. He is the current president and CEO of the National Urban League, the nation's largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. He served as the highly successful and popular mayor of New Orleans, as well as the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. He previously was a Louisiana state senator and was a lawyer in New Orleans with an active, high-profile practice. He is a leading voice on the national stage in the battle for jobs, education, housing, and voting rights equity. A graduate of Georgetown University Law Center and the University of Pennsylvania, he has been recognized as one of the 100 most influential Black Americans by Ebony Magazine, one of the top 50 nonprofit leaders by the Nonprofit Times, and one of the 100 most influential Black lawyers in America. And he has also been inducted into the International Civil Rights Walk of Fame in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you, Marc, for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And the beautiful Representative Leslie Herod, District 8, was elected in 2016 as the first LGBTQ African-American in the General Assembly. While receiving the highest number of votes of any candidate running in a contested election, she serves as the chair of the House Finance Committee, vice chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and chair of the Committee on Legal Services. Representative also chairs the Colorado Black Democratic Legislative Caucus and the Arts Caucus. Since her election in 2016, she has sent 68 bills to the governor's desk, marshaling through numerous pieces of legislation addressing criminal justice reform, mental health and substance abuse, renewable energy, youth, homelessness, and civil rights protections. Her legislative agenda underscores her commitment to improving the lives of all people in Colorado, especially those caught in the cycle of poverty or mired in the criminal justice system. Some of her signature work, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but two that are absolutely outstanding is restoring voting rights to over 11,000 people in Colorado on parole and passing the Crown Act, banning race-based discrimination on the basis of hairstyle and hair texture. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to see you.
Absolutely. So let's just get into this. Let me ask this first question before we get into voting rights. Why is this work so important to both of you? Do you remember your first foray into politics? I'll start with you, Leslie.
Absolutely. I mean, voting rights is instrumental in ensuring that we have representation in the rooms that are making decisions about us and our communities. Absolutely. And so when we talk about voting rights, I think of the legacy of voting rights. I think of the legacy of Black people who have fought to ensure that all people have access to the ballot so that we can have a true American democracy. So, in school, I heard democracy means everyone gets a voice and a vote. And then in reality, we know that doesn't exactly happen. And that in fact, Black folks, women, and others have been having to fight for their right and their access to the ballot for generations. And unfortunately, we're still here today in that exact same fight.
Absolutely. And Marc, what was your first? Why is this work so important to you?
I grew up in a family that was involved in civil rights and politics. So at a very early age, I remember going to voter registration rallies in the mid-1960s. I was very little. My parents were involved in registering Black people to vote post the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I recall distinctly, sometimes against my will, being dragged to these rallies with my mother and father because there was no other place for us to go but to go with them. And they were active in the community. And then my father ran for office for the first time when I was 9 years old. And I had an opportunity. He was a historic figure, first African-American elected to the Louisiana State Legislature since Reconstruction in those days, and had an opportunity to see old-time politics and campaigning in action. street campaign, church campaign, union hall campaign, neighborhood block party campaign. And it made an impression on me. It had an effect on me, and it interested me in those days and in those times. There's something that grates at me, that my children, my younger children are teenagers, are going to be in the middle of a fight, and we're in the middle of a fight to refight the battle to protect democracy and civil rights that our parents and grandparents fought, relitigate, rebattle, fight against the same old states' rights, Jim Crow mentality that has resurfaced itself. And that is what we need to understand, is that this is a historical cycle, and we cannot be anyways tired, dejected, cynical about the work that we have to do. It's just that important. Leslie and I served in elected office. Leslie's a historic figure in Colorado politics. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement enabled. Leslie, as a boy, I met George Brown. Does that name ring a bell for you? Black lieutenant governor
of course,
of Colorado. Yes. I was a little boy, and my dad said, "Meet the lieutenant governor." And I was like, "Whew, this is a big deal. This isn't it was in those days, people like George Brown was the equivalent of Obama, right? Black people being elected lieutenant governor, mayors of big major American cities, as my father was, and Maynard Jackson and Tom Bradley, all these guys, Coleman Young. I think that we have to recognize that this challenge is so significant. Yeah, you can. Okay. So I am just feeling like we have to energize our community. We have to say we are not tired, and we will work and we will fight, but we also have to paint the picture of how pernicious what is happening is, and that so much of it accelerated after the 2020 election and the insurrection / coup attempt of January 6th, 2021, which is one of the low days in modern American history.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I want to read a portion of the joint statement that the Urban League and other civil rights organizations put out. And then let's just talk about it. Quote, members of the U.S. Senate covered themselves in shame. They chose cowardice and discrimination over courage and principle, whether out of a willingness to deny millions of Americans their most sacred constitutional right, a spineless submission to the party line, or a misguided alliance to the arcane Senate rule. 52 senators have betrayed the nation's highest ideals. So let's unpack that statement, Leslie. When I read that, what does that say to you? How do you feel about that?
Absolutely. What that says to me is that Black folks only actually matter when it comes to getting these people in office, but not when it comes to protecting our rights. And Marc mentioned historical figures in Colorado. I want to bring up another one, and that's Barney Ford. Barney Ford was a Black slave from the South who came to Colorado as a runaway slave, wanted to be a miner in Breckenridge, but wasn't allowed to. Instead, he became a business owner and started multiple businesses right up and down Blake Street in now downtown Denver. Before Colorado became a state, he became this baron. They called him the Black Baron. And he was running business in Denver. And he said, Colorado will not become a state, will not, until Black folks are guaranteed the right to vote. So back in 1876, he stopped the state of Colorado from being able to join the Union, successfully stopped the state of Colorado from becoming and joining the Union until they guaranteed the right to vote to Blacks. Why? Because he said if Blacks could not vote, they would lose the freedoms, the protections, and the benefits they had in Colorado to that day. Things would be rolled back even further. in 1876, things would be rolled back, you know? He then, once Colorado became a state, and of course, Black folks had always had the right to vote as a state in Colorado, he then led the movement to ensure that we had non-discrimination protections right here in the state. So he could go up and open that mine if he wanted to. Of course, his businesses were flourishing and he didn't need to anymore. But that's what he did, right? And for me, that shows you that Black folks need to be at the table, whether it's in Washington or in these states as these decisions are being made, so that we can hold those elected officials accountable who like us when we turn out to vote, but don't care about us when they need to vote for us. And that's what we see here. And so everything that you just read in that statement is absolutely correct. And I want to be clear that the procedural motions that were used to stop the passage of the Voting Rights Act are based in racism and white supremacy. They are there specifically to ensure that a mobilized minority like Black folks, can be stopped in their tracks if they gain too much traction. And that's what we see happening today in Washington. And that's why some of these rules need to be removed.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Marc, and this is a statement from your organization and other organizations. I know how it makes you feel, but tell the world.
We felt it was absolutely imperative that we send the strongest possible message that what 52 members of the Senate did was unacceptable. We thought we needed to be unified and strong on this and not play politics with it, not say, "Oh, shucks, let's try something else." Because if you just look at what's happening at the state level, this is another one of these states' rights sort of battles. State after state after state after state, laws are being introduced and in many instances passed, which have no other purpose except to make it more difficult for people, particularly Black, brown, disabled, seniors, and young students to be able to vote. It's the doubling down on voter ID. It's the idea that if you vote by mail, you've got to scan a copy of your driver's license or put your driver's license number down on the form. It is cutbacks on early voting. It's closing polling places, saying there can only be one polling place in some state for every 15,000 voters. There's a range of things that are being done at the state level. It's pernicious, it's cynical, it's hateful, it's un-American, it's unnecessary, and it is all because, quote unquote, some people don't like that when people vote, their candidate didn't win. Their candidate did not win. This is sour grapes. We didn't win, so let's change the rules. Let's manipulate the process so that we can win. And we as Black people, we as Americans have to put our foot down and push back. Without democracy, how can we impact racial equity? Without democracy, how can we impact health policy or economic policy or housing policy? How can we have a seat for our voice to be heard? We cannot, in 2020, be marginalized, which is why we have to fight back. Now you see some members of the Senate saying, we have this Electoral Count Act. Hell no. Don't give us a salve. Don't give us a bill that's going to ignore the fundamental problem and seek to sanitize things. So the civil rights community, I believe, is resolute on this. And I'm having worked now at the National Urban League now for almost 2 decades, having had an held elected office for many, many years, and having been a lawyer and a civil rights lawyer, and having watched the work of my parents and their generation open doors, we cannot in good conscience sit back and allow this to happen without a vigorous fight. And so for people, look, what I want people to keep remembering, what is this all about? States' rights. Partisan legislators in Texas and Georgia, for example, passing bills on party line votes only. Arizona, to make it more difficult for people to vote. And as one Republican that I know said to me, he says, well, someone who's a little bit of an never Trump camp, he says, well, what they say behind the scenes is we have to suppress the vote to win. So let's take the charade, Leslie, let's just take the wraps off of this intent. This is intentional, and it strikes at the very heart of democracy. And they've tried every argument over the years. Fraud, we got to protect. They've now just said, we don't even need to argue fraud. We need to argue this is about us winning, us about stopping people of color from being able to vote. And so many of these states ride on tight margins. Georgia, very tight margin. Michigan, tight margins. Arizona, tight margins. So you don't have to disenfranchise millions. You can disfranchise 10, 15, 20,000 voters and alter the outcome. Who controls the House? Who controls the Senate? Who wins the White House? So it's strategic. It's surgical. It's happening in states that are battlegrounds. It is happening in ways that focus on communities where there are large numbers of Black voters, brown voters in places like Montana and Arizona. It's also the indigenous community. So we have got and the coalition of civil rights broadly, I think, are committed to battling in the courts, battling in the legislature. What do we need? We need people's voices. We need people's voices to educate and inform. The more we educate and inform, the more people are outraged. And the more people are going to put pressure on the elected officials. Sometimes I watch the United States Senate with great respect to people who get elected to office, and they seem very, very out of touch with the mainstream of America because they spend so much of their time in the world of lobbyists, in the world of staff people, in the world of people who give them money, and not in the world of people who, go make groceries at the grocery store or drop their children off at school or standing on the bus stop or the subway stop to go to work.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Are you going to add to that, Leslie?
Yeah. No, I just want to say, I mean, you talked about it being strategic and intentional. I'll add another thing. It's extremely coordinated. And so just this past year, we've had dozens and dozens of bills to restrict people's rights to vote at the state level being introduced and in some places passed. And so this is extremely, extremely coordinated because, as Marc mentioned, people are trying to ensure that we don't have the votes to win, right? That our candidates don't get elected. This is happening in swing areas. It's also happening in areas that have the potential in their primaries to elect folks on the very extreme right of their party. And that's a huge problem. We are seeing, in fact, in Colorado, bills to restrict the right to vote. But additionally, we are seeing county clerks now being under federal investigation or being sued by the state of Colorado for lying and perpetuating this fraud myth that doesn't exist, and instead tampering with the elections. Tampering with the elections in 2022. This is still an issue. This is insane, and it's happening. And so it is extremely coordinated. I'm going to ask Marc a question that I'm pretty sure you know the answer to, Marc, being an elected official. But when was the time that we had the most Black elected officials in this country?
Wow, that's a tough question. I want to say it's now.
During Reconstruction, right? In the South, I mean, it was a time, and I'm speaking in percentages. So,
in the South,
argue,
because we had a majority Black legislature in, I think, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Louisiana. I know Louisiana had 2 Black lieutenant governors and a Black governor for a period. And we in Louisiana have not elected, in Louisiana has not elected a Black person statewide since Reconstruction.
Absolutely. And that was when we got the right to vote, right? And when we started voting, we started running for office and voting. And they realized then and quickly thereafter that they had to start figuring out trickier ways to restrict our access to the ballot. And that could have been through denying felons the access to the ballot. That has been extremely successful, which is why I passed parolee voting here in Colorado, and letting people think that they don't have access. The disenfranchisement of the mind has been real. There are so many people to this day in Colorado that think if they have any type of record, they can't vote, which is not true. In fact, you can vote in jail in Colorado if you're pretrial. So there's so much that people don't even realize or know. And then the most insidious thing that's happening right now is not only do people not think that they have the right to vote, but they actually don't think that their vote matters or that anyone elected cares about them and their lives enough to make a difference. So even if they get that Democrat elected, it won't matter. It won't change the way that they live their lives. And that's the problem, right? Because when we're okay with the status quo, we're not actually even fulfilling the promises, campaign promises that we make until people are sick of hearing it. So yes, if we can sit here after the passage of John Lewis and not be able to fulfill the promise of passing the Voting Rights Act, I understand why people are questioning our efficacy right now, right? But that is a part of disenfranchisement, right? We need people to activate, to get to the ballot, to vote, and then demand that accountability of their elected officials. And if they're not accountable, they need to be out of office, which is why I'm proud to have seen folks like the Urban League, but some of my friends at the Victory Fund and other places say, we're not endorsing some of these alleged progressives who have stopped one of our hallmark issues from getting through. We are not supporting you anymore.
We cannot. We have to make this the issue that
Absolutely.
we're gonna make determination on. And you reminded me, and I appreciate the history point about Reconstruction. And I'm going to tuck that away, and I'm going to pose that question on someone else sometime soon. But I remember when I was working in a campaign in the early 80s, and we had done a big voter registration drive, got a lot of people to vote, and I was taking a young man to the polling place. Just before we walked in the polling place, he stopped. He said, I can't go in there. He says, I got a question to ask you. He says, are they going to check my record? I said, check your record. He said, man, I got a record. I said, you've been in jail? No. He says, I just been arrested a whole bunch of times. Are they going to check my record? I said, no, they're not going to check your record at the polling place. He said, well, you need to come inside with me. Yeah. Because if they're checking my record, I'm not going in there. Well, you talked in terms of people not knowing. Yeah. Not understanding when they have a legitimate right to vote. And in some states, as you mentioned, people can vote while being incarcerated. In some states, if you're incarcerated, you cannot vote. I mean, the laws are not uniform. The Early Freedom to Vote Act and some of the bills that have been out there would have restored the right to vote to the previously incarcerated. So we have a lot, Stephanie, work to do. We have to keep this issue alive. And Leslie made a good point. We've got to send a message to all of our allies, would-be allies, putative allies, trying to be allies, that where you stand on this issue will determine whether you earn our support. And we said to some members of the Senate, I want to hear your voice defending, promoting American democracy. I want to hear you with passion talk about the foundation. I have said to business leaders, you aren't going to have the kind of economic system you want if there's no democracy. You have a totalitarian operation. Mm-hmm. In a totalitarian operation, people make decisions based on politics and loyalty. Regulatory decisions are made. Lending decisions are made based on that. It's not free. It's not fair. And we've got to let people know, and we've got to educate them. But hey, it's a powerful and important discussion.
Let me ask you this question. Do you feel that young people are getting this? Do you feel that they are as outraged as our generation? We're all in the same sort of generation. Do you think that they're as outraged as we are? And if not, how do we motivate them? Because it is that younger generation that's going to help us win.
I think there's a number of things going on. I think some young people believe that because they voted in 2020, somehow the presidency is like a magic wand.
Right. Yeah.
That all you've got to do, the president can just go do that, or he can take members because they're in his own party and persuade them or punish them into cooperation. And you sometimes hear some of that. Well, and I think it's also a lesson in civics that the president proposes, the Congress disposes, and you know, the Democrats have a fragile majority, and what they have is an organizational majority, but not a legislative majority. That's what's been clear, because two important things, the Build Back Better initiative and voting rights and the the George Floyd bill have been stymied by the filibuster. And in the case of Build Back Better and the voting rights bills, stymied by two members. Two members only, right? One comes from a state where voter suppression has gone wild, Arizona, yet pretends as though it's unsettling. Young people, we have work to do, because young people, I think, came to the 2020 election with reservations. Some did, about whether voting counts. And important thing is, voting is not, you don't just vote like you press a button on a game online and then you go sit back and then boop, 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 boop. Everything you want to happen happens. That it's a dynamic process, and we have to stay engaged. And so we're going to have work to do with our young people, because I hear them say, well, I voted and this didn't happen and that didn't happen. And I said, well, you elected a president, but you didn't elect a majority Senate that was in favor of these. I mean, this is a, you know, the system we have makes reform and change that we want difficult to achieve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I think that it really boils down to what you said around, you know, we're demanding people to stand up for our democracy, or we're not going to endorse them. Can you imagine? Can you believe that we're at that place right now where we can't even trust our Democratic candidates or our Republican candidates who are wanting to be elected officials to protect democracy? That seems so basic to me. And so I think that because we are having this conversation right now, I do anticipate a lot more young folks saying, what does it matter? The young folks are completely disillusioned right now because the process has been atrocious. I mean, you can't sit here and see an insurrection, a noose outside of the Capitol, very little accountability on that, and then see folks saying that, no, not everyone deserves the right to vote. And it's coming from the party that you think you might identify with more, at least more than the other party. That's a problem. Absolutely. And so we do have to make sure that as an elected official, I take accountability for this. We do have to make sure that the work that we are doing is actually resonating and helping people in their lives today, not just bitter partisan fighting and politics that no one cares. No one cares about that, you know? And so I do think it's going to be hard not only to get young people to vote, but I think it's going to be hard to see Black folks voting. I think it's going to be hard to see a lot of people who would identify with the Democratic base voting. You know, I think the disillusionment is real, and people are in very hard times right now, and they're not seeing enough change or enough support that they can feel in their own households and in their communities.
And I'll say this, that it's and here's a challenge we face. It's a reflection of the times that disillusionment yields a response of disengagement. There was once a time where disillusionment yielded a response of we needed to do more. Mm-hmm. We need to be more pissed off. Yeah. We need to be more energized. Yeah. We need to go elect more and different people. And so what we have to say to people is disillusionment equals defeat. And it equals defeat. And I vote because I'm an institutionalist around voting, not because I'm in love with a bunch of politicians. You know, the people I vote for, I really like. The people I vote for, I'm not impressed with, right? But I'm an institutionalist. I vote by habit, like getting up, like eating breakfast, right? Like brushing my teeth, like combing my hair, like saying my prayers. I'm an institutionalist. And habit, many in the majority community vote by habit.
Right.
We have to create a culture of civic participation in our community. And we have to let people know that while as powerful it is to use social media, it by itself is not going to change the outcome of public policy.
Right.
It is just a tool of communications. It's a young person told me, I've tweeted for 5 months and been to 10 rallies and nothing has changed. And I said, little brother, let's go talk. Let me talk to you about A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King and John Lewis. They didn't tweet for 5 months.
That's right.
They didn't march for 5 months. Their struggle was 15 years long, right? I said it was a long battle, and they were on the shoulders of people who had been fighting since the end of Reconstruction, a 70-year journey to get our just due, which was basically the enforcement of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and get our respect. So it is so, I mean, I think Leslie's being very truthful about this, and I share the same sense of what I feel in the community, but then we got to fight against it. You know, even as hard as it is. And I say to young people all the time, run for office.
Right.
You know, I ran for office for the first time at 26 years of age.
Wow. Right.
I ran for delegate to the Democratic National Convention as a Jackson delegate in 1984, right? And got elected to the legislature at 32 and got elected mayor at 35. I mean, because all of us, we were all young, we didn't like what we saw. We're running for office.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of us ran and many of us won. And it was our response to, so our response was not disillusionment. Our response was, let's go topple. Let's go topple some of the establishment here. Yeah. Let's go out and make a difference. But let's make sure if we get power, we got to do something with it. We can't turn into, just occupiers of the seat.
Right.
So, it's so important. And I know this conversation has to and will continue. But Leslie, it's really, really great to meet you and look forward to meeting you in person and also to learn about your great and important contributions and your legislative record.
Thank you.
There in Colorado.
It's very long, very long.
Thank you so much. It has been an honor to be with you as well. Thank you for helping to lead our country in the right direction and for your commitment to us, to our communities and to this country. I mean, I think if folks don't know who you are, they definitely should be looking it up. Not just right now, but always, because what you've done is so very important. And Stephanie, thank you for pulling together this conversation, the ongoing conversations you're having in Colorado, out in Martha's Vineyard, and throughout the country. You're really bringing, I think, an interesting and important lens, looking at how media can interact with what we do. And I'll just end by saying, we will not win elections through social media, but getting information out that way is important. Fighting against disinformation, misinformation is important, right? Backing that Twitter comment up with a vote matters and is important. Backing that tweet up with an actual run for office to do something different or change things, that's what's going to move us in the right direction. So let's use all the tools that we have to make the change that we need.
Fantastic. Excellent. I'm inspired.